Thank you very much for this opportunity of being here and the honor to be able to share some of our experience in the area of SME development and SME finance, which is very dear to the work of the World Bank Group, both the bank and the IFC as development agencies. Not surprisingly, this is an issue which it never dies. It's always a priority issue in every country, in every government, SME development, for obvious reasons, for their weight in employment, their capacity to generate employment, their capacity to generate new jobs, their capacity to innovate. So it's a constant concern that governments have in knowing whether the sector is growing, whether there are constraints to finance, or there are other types of constraints. And we see in the world all types of constraints, usually that have to be addressed. But I will focus here on the financial side. This is what we are expected to do. So I'll be sharing with you what we have learned. What have we learned, what we have seen, what we have done in our work worldwide. You know, the World Bank is an international organization, part of the UN, United Nations network, and in charge of development. So we are in the world, watching, participating, seeing, cross-fertilizing. So I hope in the next 20 minutes to share a flavor or a vision of what we have seen and what has worked best in the past 5 or 6 years or so. This work in particular builds on a very detailed diagnostic that we have done 3 years ago of all the financial sectors in MENA. We have done this diagnostic with the Arab Monetary Fund, the Union of Arab Banks, the Islamic Development Bank, central banks of all the MENA countries, including the UAE, regulators. I mean, there was a whole mobilization of forces 3 years ago to understand better what was going well, what was not going well, and SME finance was an important topic of this effort. We also were commissioned by the G20 to analyze in depth problems of SME finance around the world. And 2 years ago, there was a very important stock taking of initiatives, what countries were doing in the area of SME finance, what was working, what was not working. And so this humongous effort produced a mass of information which I plan to try to summarize here for you. And finally, our partnerships continue. We have an ongoing partnership with the Union of Arab Banks. We do surveys of SME lending. We did one 3 years ago. We have another one happening now as we speak. And I'll talk a bit about, the preliminary results of this survey with you. We're going to start taking stock of SME financing in MENA. How does MENA compare with the rest of the world? We're going to see that MENA does not compare well with the rest of the world in terms of the extent of SME financing, especially SME lending. And we're going to see that this is due to multiple constraints that operate at the same time. We're going to assess these constraints, and we're going to propose an agenda for addressing them. Starting by talking about financial infrastructure, what's wrong in MENA about the status of financial infrastructure. Then we're going to talk about how public sectors can design effective programs to address SME lending above and beyond a good infrastructure, and we're going to talk about recent private initiatives that merit attention, merit dissemination in this region and in other regions. Now, let's look at the numbers. The chart that you see here is the share of SME loans in total bank loans. And we see here, in this small little block here, 2%. This is the average share of SME loans in total loans in GCC countries. It's one of the lowest in the world. Then we see the average for MENA, 7.6%. Then you see the average from non-GCC countries in MENA, 13, which is substantially higher, but still When we compare to the peer groups, to the relevant peer groups, other emerging countries and developed countries, the share of SME loans in total loans in MENA is very low. The share of SME loans in total loans in GCC is extremely low. So this is a line of business, a business line in banking that is not well developed in the region. When you go country by country in MENA, we see the patterns. We see again, most GCC countries have very little engagement in SME business. This is data which is 2 to 3 years old. But according to the second survey with the UAB, things have not changed too much. And in some countries, because of the global crisis and the Arab Spring, in fact, in some countries, this share has actually gone down, not up. So we see in the GCC very low levels of SME lending. The UAE within the GCC is in a good position, is the country where the banks are more engaged, but still in a very limited way. Then we start asking ourselves, what are the constraints? What's happening? What is holding the banks? Is not only the banks, as we will see very soon, from providing more SME finance. So we see here, in our analysis of SME finance in the region, we see a host of problems. The first thing that caught our attention in MENA was the lack of progress in building financial infrastructure. What do we mean by financial infrastructure? What defines it? There are basically 3 main components of financial infrastructure. The first one is accounting and auditing. Financial reporting by SMEs. All the banks and creditors in the world complain about SME opacity, say their accounts are not good, I cannot see if it's a good credit for me, if it's not a good credit. In MENA, this problem is particularly acute, the opacity of the SME sector. The second problem that we have noticed is the lack of coverage of credit registries. There is very little information on credit worthiness. Even if you have the accounts are more or less in shape, the credit histories are not well recorded. The coverage of the SME sector is not very good. The quality of the information is not very good. As a result, the registries and the bureaus cannot build credit scores. They cannot build SME ratings because the information base is not there, among other reasons. And that is another obstacle that creditors have to face, lack of information. I'm sorry, hitting the wrong button. The third problem is the chain of secured lending. What do we mean by secured lending? We mean creditor rights. Creditor rights in MENA are weak because the whole legal framework for secured lending is not very well developed. What do we mean by that? We mean the law does not provide for many types of collateral. Registries of movable collateral are not well developed. They are not modern. Very few countries in MENA have done progress in this area. Very few. Some of them have. What do we mean by a good collateral registry? We mean a centralized, electronic, easy to access database where a creditor, when receiving a loan application, can see whether that SME has some collateral to offer, either in the case of inventories or receivables or whatever it is. Easy to access. The collateral is there, it exists, has not been pledged by anybody else, and it can be accessed with the push of a button. That's what we call a modern collateral registry. Very few countries have this. They are usually very fragmented. They are usually paper-based. They are fragmented in many cities. They are hard to access. And that creates an enormous problem for the creditor. The other problem is enforcement. Once you have the collateral, can you enforce it? And all the banks in the region report enormous problems in enforcing collateral, especially out of court. So the whole financial infrastructure is missing. This is not news. We had a whole series of conferences in this region about this. There was a consensus. We had a conference 2 years ago in Abu Dhabi in the premises of the Arab Monetary Fund. It was a 2-day conference only on financial infrastructure. And there was a consensus among policymakers, this is something that we have to solve. I don't know how much progress happened in the last 2 years, but I saw the results of the survey, the new survey of the UAB, and I see the banks complaining about the same thing. They are still complaining exactly about the same thing, lack of financial infrastructure. Then what else needs to be fixed? We saw gaps in the legal and institutional framework. For example, leasing. Leasing is a segment of the financial industry that is important. It can be a channel of finance to SMEs, especially when the financial infrastructure is weak, because there is a perception that you can lease an asset, an equipment, a car, and the lessor can repossess that asset when the lessee does not pay. And to our surprise here, we saw a very fragmented legislation in leasing in MENA. The primary laws are still not in place. We saw that the leased assets are not well registered because the registry is not there. And to our surprise, we saw people complaining about repossession of the leased asset when the lessee does not pay, the rent. So there is also a problem of a basic problem in institutions, the registration, and in legislation. In factoring, we saw factoring, another important channel of finance for SMEs, very underdeveloped in the region as well. Now we talk about policy intervention. So what did we see governments doing? When the basic legal and financial infrastructure is not in place, what have we seen governments doing? In some cases, governments get tempted to use state banks to lend to SMEs. And in countries where there are state banks, they tell them lend to SMEs. So what is the record of state banks? We saw a very mixed record. Sometimes in countries where there's state bank and the government tells the state bank, you go and lend to SMEs, they do. But the question is, do they do it well? Do they do it with criteria? Do they manage the risks well? Do they select them well? Or this is just political lending without criteria, without risk management? So we saw a very mixed record there. There were very few success stories, in our opinion. State banks that were doing a good job in lending to the SME sector, doing good screening of good SMEs, managing the risk well. There were very few cases. We saw the PCB in Morocco as a good example, a bank which has an enormous good penetration in rural areas, in villages, construction based on a French bank that has a similar structure. We saw a Saudi Industrial Development Bank also doing a very good job in risk management in Saudi Arabia, leading to manufacturing SMEs. So there were a few sporadic cases like that, but we didn't see overall a success story here. Then we shifted to guarantee schemes. There we saw more possibilities. We saw that guarantee schemes were a better form of intervention than state banks, because guarantee schemes engage the private sector more directly, engage the private banks more directly. And to our surprise, we saw that the countries that had the largest guarantee schemes in the region, such as Morocco and Lebanon, were countries that have developed more SME finance in the region. So we saw a correlation. We tested actually statistically, and it worked. It shows that this is a type of intervention which is preferable, can yield better results than have a state bank lending directly to the SME sector. But we saw room for improvements as well, even in this type of intervention. Finally, we noticed that there are some private initiatives out there in the course of our work that were not well disseminated in the MENA region. Things that banks, private banks, are doing in other regions, in other parts of the world, trying to work with the SME sector, trying to improve the way they operate, trying to provide training, trying to provide assistance. We saw initiatives, the most recent one, which is causing a lot of interest worldwide, is called the Entrepreneurial Finance Lab, which is a technique to try to screen good from bad SMEs, those that will repay and those will not, from psychometric tests. One of the latest innovations in SME finance that we have seen developed by Harvard University, and we saw that this initiative had not been well disseminated in the region. So we saw a host of interesting things to be done as part of this agenda. Now, what to do then? A country like Dubai, a province like Dubai or the UAE who is trying to promote SME finance, or any other MENA country, what do we propose? Well, first thing we propose when countries come to us, we propose, we propose an integrated approach. Many countries follow an integrated approach. They have actually a strategy, a country-level strategy to promote SME finance. It's not just an ad hoc, sporadic initiatives, disconnected from each other. They actually do, we do with these countries when we ask for a complete diagnostic of what we call the architecture of SME finance. And we go bit by bit, piece by piece. We look at the banking sector, we look at banking regulations, we look at financial infrastructure, we look at the leasing sector, the factoring sector, we look at everything. And we have a complete mapping of the situation, and then therefore we devise an action plan with the government to address each of these components. This, in our opinion, a preferred thing, because then we have a coherent action plan to promote SME finance. And then we start with infrastructure. We always say first things first. First things first. This is the basic. If you want to have a coherent agenda for developing SME finance, developing financial infrastructure is the first thing that a country should do. How do we start? Let's start with basics. Financial reporting for SMEs. Every creditor likes to have a set of accounts, a business plan, a balance sheet, an income statement, something that is reliable. An SME has to work with something which is relatively simple as well. You cannot impose IFRS for large firms to an SME because it's too costly. So there is one alternative. Many countries are now following what is called IFRS for SMEs, which is a very simple version of the IFRS, the international IFRS. Some countries still think that IFRS for SMEs is still too complicated, and they design their own standards, usually in consultation with the banks. But it's important to have a standard, a simple one, that SMEs can follow to build their accounts when they do a loan application or any other application for finance. We saw a lot of capacity building by public agencies or banks in educating SMEs on how precisely to do this. Then we go for the credit registry. We saw a need to improve credit registries or to create credit bureaus. Usually countries that have good credit reporting systems have both. They have a public registry and they have a private bureau, and they complement each other usually very well. In MENA, we see many countries only with a public registry. And we ask ourselves, can that work? It can. But it's going to require special effort from that public registry, which is usually inside the central bank, to operate like a private bureau, meaning to really, increase the coverage of the household and the SME sector, to increase the sources of data and information, to provide value-added services such as credit scores of SME ratings. Usually registries do not do that. It is impossible, no, but it requires a special public effort for the registry to go in this direction. We saw several new promising examples in MENA, bureaus and registries that were going in this direction, like in Oman, Saudi Arabia, the SEMA Bureau is doing a reasonably good job in this area. We saw the Moroccan new credit bureau also going in this direction. So there are some promising examples in MENA going on. Finally, the need to strengthen the whole chain of secured lending. This is an important area of infrastructure. The region does need to do better here, create collaterals for movables, registries for movables, and introduce out-of-court enforcement. The creditor, once upon default, can easily foreclose on the collateral. This is important to reduce the risks of lending. Now, what else is there to do? Leasing and factoring. Leasing legislation is important to fix it. It's important to have a law that specifies the rights to the lessor, introducing a collateral registry, and the right to repossess the lease asset. I think there is an important gap in the legislation framework of many countries in this area. What to do in the area of factoring? We usually, and it's still a good recommendation, we recommend the countries take a look at Mexico's experience in this area. It's a very interesting experience. It's called a reverse factoring platform, in which the SMEs that are suppliers to a large firm are irrigated by the large firm. The factor provides finance to the large firm, and the large firm irrigates the suppliers, which are SMEs. This is a very innovative type of factoring that was pioneered by Mexico, and that has been looked at with a lot of interest by many countries. State banks, can they play a more effective role? Mandates and governance remain a challenge in state banks. This is not our main recommendation. Go and set up a state bank to lend to SMEs, because things could go wrong. We have seen, again, state banks around the world that do a good job, but they tend to be the exception rather than the rule. The best SME bank in the world that we know, among all the countries that we have been to and all the institutions that we have been to, is the SME Bank of Canada. This is really a gem, a jewel of example of a bank that was created to complement the private sector, not to compete with the private sector. Is a bank that has to generate a profit, is a bank that has a clean governance structure. There is a bank that doesn't receive any type of interference of any kind in its operations. But this construction has been very difficult to replicate in other countries. We favor instead an improvement of credit guarantee schemes, because we think that for the MENA region this is a better form of intervention, and we see scope for achieving better results in this area, but the design of these schemes needs to be more improved to improve the incentives. What do we mean the design? The eligibility criteria, the fees, the coverage ratio, a set of incentives to make sure that the SMEs who receive a guarantee have incentives to repay the loan and the guarantee agency. But we see scope for interesting work in this area, highlighting once again that there are success stories in the region. We see the Moroccan kafalat and the Moroccan, the Lebanese kafalat and the Moroccan guarantee agencies as good examples. Two countries that have been more than the others able to promote SME lending, and we believe that guarantee schemes are part of the one of the reasons why they achieve better results. We note other public sector initiatives that are interesting. I invite you to read one of the G20 reports that we have computed for the G20, because there is a host of examples, an incredible number of initiatives and experiments that were done in around the world to promote SME finance. I'm just mentioning a couple of them here. And I invite you to go to the documents and see for yourselves what has been done. Quite a few innovative, imaginative things have been done In my country, Brazil, for example, in the area of venture capital for SMEs, they created an IT platform for high-tech SMEs, technological SMEs. They put a platform that puts together venture capitalists on the one hand, SMEs on the other, sharing an enormous amount of information, facilitating venture capital investment in SMEs, facilitating partnerships. It's a fantastic platform, IT platform, that puts together universities, research centers, SMEs, venture capitalists, and has been able to generate quite a few interesting transactions. What else? Finally, private initiatives. What have we seen the banks themselves or private sector itself doing? We have seen the banks themselves. In some countries, the banks get impatient. They get impatient because they see that financial infrastructure is not being improved fast enough. They still see lots of problems with information, lots of problems with balance sheets, also opacity, lack of credit history, so they by themselves start doing something. So some banks went ahead and they tried to start providing non-financial services to SMEs in order to provide training for the SMEs to build a business plan, to put their accounts in order. So there was a whole host of initiatives of the banks to work with their clientele. This, of course, involves costs by the bank. The bank this is costly, this is not cheap. The bank has to put a budget, and the banks, of course, expect to have that return back. And some banks have been very successful in doing that. Usually it requires scale, because you get, after 5 or 6 years, a very good clientele of SMEs in terms of volume and in terms of quality. Not every country was able to replicate that, but there were some very good examples to examine, like TEB Bank in Turkey, Standard Chartered, ICICI in India. There is quite a few cases that were very well documented in World Bank and IFC documents. And finally, the latest arrival in the market. This is creating really, a lot of interest. It's called the Entrepreneurial Finance Lab. This is a technique, a psychometric test, a technique for screening SMEs that was designed by Harvard researchers in the Harvard Kennedy School. It's a questionnaire with 150 questions. It was designed to try to screen good borrowers in situations where there is almost nothing to work with. There is no information, there's no balance sheet, there's no financial reporting, there's no credit registry. The bank is operating blind, is flying blind. So what do you do when the bank is flying blind? They created a psychometric test where the owner of the SME fills a questionnaire during 1 hour, 150 questions, which are designed to detect whether he's really going to pay that loan or not. And, they say, through repeated experimentation in more than 25 countries, that this test provides better measures the probability of default than credit scores with a lot of intensive data. And they have tested this in many countries, and they think this is the cure to all ills in the world. We have found, and I invite, they have a website, an interesting website, that you can visit. You can see, it's a proprietary, of course, information. They disclose just part of the questions that they usually do in this session. And some banks in the world are already embarking on this new initiative. The first major bank that started using this technology is Standard Bank in South Africa, and they report very promising, results in South Africa itself, in all the neighboring countries in Africa where Standard Bank is present. Again, a private initiative that was designed to try to compensate for deficiencies in the enabling environment, in financial infrastructure, in the legal framework. So this is the host of initiatives that I'm pleased to share with you. There is much more to be told. Unfortunately, in 20 minutes, it's difficult to go beyond the tour d'horizon. But the usual sources, these initiatives, these experiments are described in much more detail in these 4 or 5 publications of the World Bank and the IFC. The MENA Financial Sector Flagship, published 2011. The 2 reports commissioned by the G20 to the World Bank and the IFC. The recent Global Financial Development Report, published a few months ago. And finally, our surveys with the Union of Arab Banks, the first of which published, the second one to be published later this year. So we hope that these sources can provide you with ideas of options and alternatives to try to develop, meet the challenge of SME finance in Dubai ahead of the important event this very promising important event that is ahead of you in a few years. So thank you very much once again.